This is The Strange Recital, a podcast about fiction which questions the nature of reality.
What's it like, having hair growing out of your face? Elsie asked as she watched her ecology professor shave in the shade of a hemlock grove. He paused and looked at her. "You have hair growing out of your face," he said. "You should know what it's like." Elsie's cheeks grew hot and she looked away. She was sensitive about her few chin hairs. But Andy didn't insult and he rarely teased. He probably just meant her eyebrows. She turned back and watched him shave again. He let her watch, ignoring her gaze, as distant and professional as if they sat in his classroom back on campus. She felt safe with him. She didn't know why. She never played the little kid except with him, but she couldn't tell if he liked or merely tolerated the act. Without his white stubble, he looked younger, but Elsie could not guess his age. Personally, he remained a mysterious blank. Professionally, she knew he was impressive. Dr. Andrew Coate was one of the few scientists left from before the pandemic. And unlike a lot of survivors, he hadn't left his old career behind. Instead, he and a very few colleagues had fought to save data and scientific literature from failing computers and then spent years reweaving professional networks and academic systems. 20 years later, he was still at it, crisscrossing the country on foot every summer. She planned to be an environmental educator, not a researcher, but she'd asked him to sponsor her application to the professional guilds anyway. Nobody knew more than he did about how science functioned as a human community, and nobody was better than him at explaining how to work with people. That, and she admired his simple, fearless doggedness. Everything else was a matter of rumor. People said he'd lost a wife and children in the pandemic, but of course a lot of people had. It was his refusal to discuss his family that lifted common tragedy to mythic status. Opinions split over whether he had remarried. Elsie had noticed, traveling with him, that he recorded video messages to someone every night on his little tablet computer. He didn't know she knew. She had overheard him once, just the tone of his voice, soft and gentle, and she'd resolved never to overhear again. She'd defend him from anyone, if necessary, even from her own curiosity. She never asked him if the rumors were true. She did once ask him to explain what 10% survival rate really meant in human terms. Andy had knelt beside her and asked her to put out her hands. She had laid them, all 10 fingers, on the cool brown needles of the forest floor. The man drew his pocket knife and brought it down hard on her left pinky. Of course he didn't cut her, but it took all her will not to flinch. He repeated the motion with each of her other fingers, and each time she felt a thrill of fear and the impression of the knife blade lingering on her skin. When he had mimed cutting off all of her fingers but one, he folded away his knife and caught up that one surviving finger, her right pinky, in his own warm hand and gave it a friendly little shake. "Now live the rest of your life like this," he'd said. Andy was shaving because after 4 weeks backpacking up from Pennsylvania, they were drawing near the first of Elsie's speaking engagements. Andy had a rule against coming into town dirty from the road, the way most travelers did. He said if you want to embody the professional, you have to look the part from the minute someone first sees you. You have to manage the impression you make on the world. "Why don't you just grow your beard out?" she asked. Most men did. "I don't know," he answered. "Habit." Elsie packed up the kitchen kit, getting ready for the day's hike. When Andy was my age, she thought, he didn't have to walk everywhere. He'd had his own car and had flown to conferences on airplanes. But technically, he didn't have to walk now either. Even without fossil fuels, there were other options. She'd once asked why they didn't ride horses or bicycles. "Too much to keep track of," he'd answered. Many people of his generation said things like that. Elsie knew it was because they'd become timid about having anything they might lose. but she'd come to doubt Andy could be timid about anything. And anyway, he had a point. The pack had quickly come to feel like a part of her body. She could forget its weight, take its contents for granted, and if she wanted to bushwhack up an interesting-looking ridge or hop into somebody's horse cart at a road crossing, everything she needed simply came with her, automatically. She and her teacher were free as turtles, needing nothing for shelter but their persons. "So tell me about this place," Andy said, quizzing her. "This hill was once part sheep farm, part woodlot," she began. "I think there were some forest fires, small ones, like sparks from a larger fire somewhere else. This hill became protected land, some kind of park or preserve before the pandemic. A family lived here during the transition, but they didn't stay long. Now it's protected again, a game sanctuary probably." "Do not say 'I think,'" Andy corrected her. "You can be wrong, but do not be unsure. How do you know all this?" "The rock walls mean sheep, but some of the trees look old enough to predate the sheep farm abandonment, and they aren't shaped like field trees. So I don't think the whole hill was ever cleared. Multi-trunk trees and paired scars at the bases of some trees suggest logging, but that was also a long time ago, because those trunks are pretty big. The hemlock patches are younger than the trees around them, so they are growing in patches where the forest was cleared away. Even the leaf litter had to be gone, because hemlocks need bare soil to sprout in. A fire could do that. Some of the hemlocks are long dead. Adelgids, obviously, but no one cleaned up the snags, so this area was being managed as wildland at the time. There are stumps from trees cut with axes. No one felled trees with axes before the pandemic, but there's no sign of recent logging either. And the deer let us see them, at least briefly, so no one hunts here now, and no one has in the memory of the deer." "Good. What's an adelgid?" Andy knew perfectly well, of course. He was still quizzing her. "A tiny bug, hard to see. Introduced from Asia? They eat hemlocks and the American trees had no resistance. Biocontrol, importing predator insects from the adelgid's homeland, helped some, but not enough. Some people thought we were going to lose eastern hemlocks completely, but then a new disease wiped out most of the adelgids. Since then, the predators have been able to keep them in check, so we still have hemlock groves, like this one." "Are adelgids bugs?" This time Andy was probably not quizzing. He wasn't an entomologist, and there were things he did not know. "I don't know. I meant bugs in the colloquial sense. I figured anyone around here who didn't know what a hemlock woolly adelgid is probably called all arthropods bugs." "Good thinking." Elsie looked around at the forest. Nothing could grow in the deep shade of a hemlock grove except more hemlocks, and she could see nothing beyond the furrowed, reddish trunks but a few giant white pines. The short, irregular needles above gave the foliage a feathery appearance, but they hung in shadow and created shadow, all muted red and black, and suggested a different metaphor. The forest was a palace, a ruined palace, and the ragged, hanging foliage was just so much spider web, spider feathers, gracing the chandeliers and the balustrades, the great arching beams of ballrooms still echoing with the dances of long ago. The whole forest was close and still, a dark silence that persisted despite the occasional singing of spring birds. Though Elsie knew hemlock forests supported dozens of species of insects and birds and salamanders, the place felt abandoned, melancholy. "It's funny," she said at last. "All this could have been gone if it weren't for the disease that killed so many of the adelgids. And then the adelgids would have been gone too. They would have killed off their own food supply. Now both insect and tree have a chance. So diseases can be good sometimes. But the same thing happened to us, and the pandemic certainly wasn't good." "Diseases aren't good or bad," Andy replied. "They just are." Elsie could think of no response, so she let the silence settle. Andy unpacked the charging kit for his tablet computer and glanced up. "There's no sun here," he he complained. He followed a game trail out of camp, and Elsie followed him uphill out of the hemlocks to a hiking trail that led to a summit in a grove of red and sugar maple, red oak, and white pine. The April sunlight fell through the still bare tree branches in lacy yellow patches, and the slope before them opened to a bright view of rolling hills and a wooded valley. The overlook was artificial. Someone kept the rocky slope free of trees for several hundred feet. After a minute, Elsie realized why. Here, among the remnants of last year's bindweed and a few leafless wineberry canes, crouched a crumbling square of stone, like another sheep wall, but one that turned and met itself, enclosing perhaps 400 square feet. It was the foundation of a long-vanished house. The current land manager must keep the view open for the sake of visitors to the historic site. Elsie sat nearby and considered the foundation. She was used to ruins, but this one was obviously older, predating the pandemic. There is no one left who knows who lived here or why, she mused. But she was wrong. The history of the house was easy to look up, and Andy had done so years earlier. She just didn't think to ask. Andy hunted around on the open slope until he found a good, flat, sunny patch and set up his tablet to charge. Then he joined her and they looked out over the valley together. "Why is it important that the hemlock woolly adelgea came from Asia?" he asked, continuing the quiz. "Because it's exotic," began Elsie, then realized that explained nothing. She started over. Species with no evolutionary history in a place seldom do well. Either they don't survive at all, or they multiply out of control because nothing has evolved to eat them or to make them sick. Always? I don't know. Often. Some plants naturalize without taking over, but they just sit there ecologically. Nothing eats them, or hardly anything anyway. The exotics might as well be made of plastic. They take up space. They don't belong. What about us? Do we belong? Andy asked, eyes suddenly shining. The rest of his face remained neutral, except for a hint of smile. His face was usually quiet, like that of one who through blindness or other circumstance had never known another's gaze. But his non-expressions varied. This one was quick, excited. Ideas were a game to Andy, and he wanted to see how well Elsie could handle a curveball. Elsie smiled at him nervously for just a moment. By defining nativity in evolutionary terms, she'd implied that people like the Abenaki or the Micmac were evolutionarily distinct from other New Englanders, a frankly racist idea. On the other hand, to deny that some people are native and others aren't seemed just as bad. Biological evolution isn't the issue for humans, she clarified. We can learn how to form the relationships that make us native, how to find and use the resources we need, and how to recognize and honor our limitations before we destroy so much. But it doesn't happen quickly. You have to get familiar with the place, everything that lives there, and how it lives, and how it affects you, and you affect it. Maybe you have to grow up with the place so it becomes part of you. It probably takes multiple generations to develop a native culture. Maybe Yankees are native now, or maybe they're still homeless. But they can start becoming native and get there in 100 years or 1,000 years. By Yankees, she meant the cultural descendants of European colonists. It was an ethnic, not a racial term. But I'm not a Yankee. I don't belong particularly anywhere. As she spoke, she dug her fingers into the soil, as though her hands were trying to grow roots, trying and failing. Andy glanced at her sharply for a moment. Elsie didn't notice. She was looking down the bare slope to where a fissure, a clot of animate shadow, hopped here and there under the trees at the far end of the clearing. I used to live there, Andy said at last, a gesture of his hand taking in the whole valley, even beyond where they could see. There was a good-sized town. It looks like there is still a good-sized town, ventured Elsie, noting a few buildings and farm fields in among the trees. No, I mean something bigger. You couldn't see it from here, but you could hear the traffic. Oh, You mean before? Elsie meant before the pandemic. If Andy minded his life being divided thus into two different eras, he gave no sign. He simply said yes. What was it like? Before? She asked in a dreamy voice. Don't you remember? Replied Andy. I'm not that old. No, I don't. I was alive, but I don't remember. I don't remember anything before I was around 10, a few years after the pandemic. That means you don't remember the transition period either? This world is the only one you know? Yes, I don't even know stories. My mother and her friends won't talk about it, and I don't want to ask anyone else. Her hands still worked the soil. Andy looked puzzled. I'm a cop, she explained. Was a cop, anyway. I didn't want it to get out that I have memory problems. Andy nodded. Will you tell me? She asked. Yes, he answered. But then the silence stretched on so long that he obviously wasn't going to tell her just then. Can we explore down there? The town? She said. Sure. We're not due at Homestead till tomorrow. But we should get going, if you want to have time to look around today.
That was Ecological Memory, written by Caroline Ailanthus and read by Eleanor Cage. This is an excerpt from the novel Ecological Memory by Caroline Ailanthus, Saltwater Media, LLC, 2019.
Welcome to the Strange Recital, Caroline.
Thank you.
We just heard an excerpt from your novel, Ecological Memory. Where does this section fit in the overall story? And can you give us a brief synopsis of the novel?
Yeah, it's actually at the very beginning. I figured that would make the most sense because it introduces the characters in the world of the book. Elsie doesn't remember her childhood home, and she wants to. She starts having flashbacks of the trees she played among as a child, and Andy, her mentor, being an ecologist, offers to help her figure out where that mix of trees grows. The same mix of species doesn't grow just anywhere. And from that point on, the book becomes this scientific detective story / road trip through post-apocalyptic New England.
I'm sure that most listeners understood that the pandemic referred to was not the COVID crisis, since your story takes place 20 years after a fictional pandemic killed 90% of humans. I find it interesting that your novel was published in 2019, and a few months later, COVID hit. Were you part of Event 201, the simulation, or maybe you're psychic?
Not that I know of. I needed a disaster for the plot to work, and I just picked a pandemic because it was plausible. The thing is, the people who study this sort of thing were not surprised by COVID. It's like the big one, like, earthquakes and so forth. You don't know where it's going to happen. You don't know when it's going to happen. You know it's going to happen. COVID was not a surprise to the experts, and I just read what the experts said. So that's how I did that. By the way, in the story, it's not the disease that kills 90% of humans. It's a disease that crashes all of the networks, the economic networks that we have, and that kills 90% of humans. Critical distinction. Just wanted to put that in.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting that you approach fiction through the doorway of science. You have degrees in environmental leadership and conservation biology. This book educates as it entertains.
Yeah, I learned what an adelgid is.
Me too. Now, why did you choose fiction writing rather than science writing? Or do you do both?
Both. I don't have much opportunity for scholarly writing these days, but sometimes I'll have a freelance client I can do that kind of work for. And one of my blogs covers climate change and does a lot of science topics.
This novel must have presented a bit of a world-building challenge. We heard in the excerpt that some technologies still exist, like Andy's tablet, but others don't, like gasoline engines. Tell us about your process of deciding what the world would be like 20 years after the death of most of the human race.
Part of it is I wanted to tell a story about a certain kind of world. So I worked backwards from that to some degree.
Mm-hmm.
What has to happen in order for this world to exist? Other things like what the climate ought to be like that far in the future and so forth involve looking at projections made by experts. But as to the technology part, in the world I built, no technology is actually lost in the sense of just nobody knows how to do this anymore. Even if all the experts in a given field died, which is possible with that kind of thing, there are books and so forth. But the collapse shut down the economic systems, as I said, that made fossil fuel viable. So the age of fossil fuel just ended, and the survivors decided to not put that back together.
Oh.
People don't have cars anymore. They don't have airplanes and so forth. That's not the loss of technology. It's the reorientation of technology. There actually are still engines in this world. It's just that they run on ethanol or biodiesel. And things like that cost the equivalent of about $20 a gallon. So they're only used for emergency vehicles.
Well, in this excerpt, we learned that Elsie is a former cop. Tell us about the significance of that in the story.
The thing is, Elsie has this sort of childlike aspect, and that's really on full view in the first paragraph of the story. And I wanted her to have that, but I also wanted her to be more than that. I wanted her to have this tough, confident aspect. So I thought, okay, what's the quickest way that I can indicate that she's tough and confident and, a grown-up? First thing I thought of was making her a cop. So that's how that happened.
One interesting question you raised in this excerpt is, how long does it take for a people, say invaders or immigrants, to be considered native to a region? Both Tom and I came from elsewhere, but we've lived in this little town for decades and raised families here. At what point, if ever, might we stop being considered newcomers from the city? Of course, I don't really expect you to answer that.
I have an answer, actually.
Ah.
Ecological nativity, according to Doug Ptolemy, whose work you really should read, by the way, is a matter of relationships. That's his way of characterizing it. So if a species has been somewhere long enough to have co-evolved with the other species in the area, like how the hemlock species in Asia evolved a way to survive adelgid attacks, then it's native and not otherwise. Humans certainly can be native or not in that sense. Human ecology is a real thing. We are animals.
True.
But you're talking about social nativity. The same idea applies. So if you've lived in this town long enough so that you have relationships that are part of who you are, then you're native. If not yet, then you're not. And the sad thing is that a lot of us these days aren't really native anywhere.
Well, that's the nature of America, isn't it? Now, if nativity should not be defined evolutionarily, for humans at least, shouldn't it be defined simply by historical timeline? That would remove the racism issue.
Or if it's defined by birth, I'm a native of a small town in Idaho where I only lived for a few months and never went back. That doesn't seem right.
Well, anytime you apply a simple idea rigidly to a complex world, you get problems.
Yeah.
Would you say there's a particular philosophy or set of ideas that underpin your fiction work?
Oh, probably, but I don't know what it's called. My friend Joel could tell you. He's a philosopher. Literally, he has a PhD in philosophy and everything.
Well, it's too bad he can't be here today. Brent has a few questions about reality, right?
Yeah. Well, environmental concerns are everywhere, with many of the biggest corporate and government offenders jumping on the bandwagon. So how much of what we hear from them do you suppose is greenwashing?
Most of it. That's an important question. It's important to check who's actually walking the talk, and it's not always obvious either. Because there are real changes that start small and subtle. And then on the other hand, there are programs that sound great and don't work, changes that sound impressive and aren't because somebody's using misleading statistics, that sort of thing. You have to really know your stuff, or at least find somebody else who does.
Yeah. Now, Ecological Memory is your second novel. Tell us a little bit about your first one.
To Give a Rose. Yeah, it's mostly set a couple million years ago among proto-human ape-like creatures. Talk about world building. I had to recreate the whole East African Pliocene. There's a modern human artist, too, drawing inspiration from fossils.
Do you have a new writing project in the works?
I do. I'm actually working on multiple projects at once, but the next one to come out is going to be a sequel to Ecological Memory. It will be a collection of short-ish fiction, all set in the same world. Secondary characters in one story are going to be the primary characters in another story, that sort of thing.
Just one other thing. I've heard that you've described this book as post-apocalyptic optimism. That's an intriguing concept, seeing as the apocalypse is usually seen as dark and dystopian. Can you elaborate?
Yeah, well, a dystopia is a kind of place. An apocalypse is a kind of event. So an apocalypse as such can't be dystopian. It's just not the right sort of noun. An apocalypse is just the destruction of the world as we know it. What comes afterwards can be anything, good or bad. It's really curious to me that people have mostly forgotten the possibility that the next thing could be good. If my book does anything, in addition to entertaining, I hope it's to remind people that change can lead to something good, because we're going to have change anyway.
Yeah.
That's what unsustainable means. The society as we know it is not going to be around indefinitely. The only real question is what we want to happen next and how we want the real transition to be.
True. Well, thanks, Caroline. It's been a pleasure talking to you.
Thanks for having me.
Yes, thank you. Post-apocalyptic optimism. Does that mean everything's going to be all right?
Maybe. This is The Strange Recital, on the web at thestrangerecital.com. The music on this episode was Springish by Gillicuddy. This is episode 23011.